So HI 102, to continue in Chapter 9, the Conservative Revival, what were some of the other social and economic issues and innovations of the 1980s? And this is a changing economic and social landscape in that decade, because during the 80s there were profound changes that transformed American life. The economy went through a wrenching transformation in adapting to increasingly interconnected global marketplace. The nations that had been most devastated by World War II, France, Germany, the Soviet Union, Japan, and China, had by the 1980s developed formidable economies with higher levels of productivity than the United States. Mainly, they're more energy efficient. More and more American manufacturing companies shifted their production overseas, thereby accelerating the transition of the economy from its once dominant industrial base to a more services-oriented economy. Driving all of these changes was the impact of the computer revolution and the development of the internet. And this computer revolution is an idea that had been around since the 18th century, something that can perform mental tasks quickly, but it took the Second World War to gather the intellectual and financial resources needed to create such a computer. In 1946, a team of engineers at the University of Pennsylvania created the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, the first all-purpose, all-electronic digital computer, and it probably took up an entire room. The next major breakthrough was the invention in 1971 of the microprocessor, virtually a tiny computer on a silicon chip. And this tiny silicon chip, this computer on a chip, paved the way for the development of the personal computer. And in 1975, an engineer named Ed Roberts developed the Altair 8800, the prototype of the personal computer. Its potential excited a Harvard sophomore named Bill Gates, who improved the software of the Altair 8800, dropped out of college, and formed a company called Microsoft to sell the new system. By 1977, Gates and others, Steve Jobs will come in the 80s with the Mac. They transformed the personal computer into a mass consumer product. And the development of the internet, electronic mail, and cell phone technology during the 80s and 90s allowed for instantaneous communication, thereby accelerating the globalization of the economy, dramatically increasing productivity in the workplace and transforming the way people communicated with each other. And there's carefree consumers, because during the 80s, Ronald Reagan lowered the tax rate so that people would have more money to spend and thereby accelerate the growth of the economy. And Americans had little trouble going on a spending spree. During the Reagan era, marketers and advertisers celebrated instant gratification. Michelob beer commercials promised that you could have it all, and many people glorified self-indulgence. Compulsive shoppers donned T-shirts proclaiming "Born to Shop," and money, lots of it, came to define the American dream. And in the hit movie Wall Street, the high-flying land developer and corporate raider Gordon Gekko, played by actor Michael Douglas, announced that greed is good and greed is right. What about the poor? The 80s were years of vivid contrast. Despite unprecedented prosperity, growing numbers of jobless Americans were without hope. Widespread homelessness, estimated at 400,000 people. Most urban areas had homeless people wandering around in the 80s, and it became the most acute social issue. A variety of causes had led to a shortage of low-cost housing. The government had given up on building public housing. They had sold a lot of those projects back to the localities. Urban renewal projects of the late 60s and 1970s had demolished blighted residential areas, but they never provided any housing for those who were displaced. Or owners abandoned unprofitable buildings in poor neighborhoods, and this is still going on today. They converted them into expensive condominiums, a process called gentrification. In addition, after new medications allowed for the release of some mentally ill patients from institutions, many of them ended up on the streets because the promised mental health services failed to materialize. Drug and alcohol abuse were rampant among the homeless, mostly unemployed single adults. A quarter of them, about 100,000 people, had spent time in mental institutions, and some 40% had spent time in jail. A third were delusional. The AIDS epidemic. Still another group of outcasts in the 80s included those suffering from acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. At the beginning of the decade, public health officials warned that gay men and intravenous drug users were especially at risk for developing AIDS. People contracted the human immunodeficiency virus by coming into contact with bodily fluids. And here's the AIDS Memorial Quilt. It's composed of more than 48,000 panels, and it was first conceptualized by gay rights and AIDS activist Cleve Jones to commemorate those who had died of AIDS-related causes. And this quilt continues to grow today. So, coming in contact with these bodily fluids or blood can infect you with the virus, and then that causes AIDS. And AIDS-infected people or virus-infected people showed signs of extreme fatigue. They developed a strange combination of infections, and they soon died. And this was often a fatal disease of the immune systems when it first appeared in the 1980s. Today, there are high-powered steroid drugs that can maintain people from getting AIDS, but they still have the virus. And it's not as deadly as it was a generation ago. The Reagan administration showed little interest in AIDS in part because it was viewed as a gay disease, and Patrick Buchanan, the conservative commentator who served as Reagan's director of communications, said that homosexuals had declared war on nature, and nature was extracting an awful retribution. Buchanan and others convinced Reagan not to engage the HIV/AIDS issue, and by the year 2000, AIDS had claimed almost 300,000 American lives and was spreading among a larger segment of the population. Nearly 1 million Americans were carrying the deadly virus, and it had become the leading cause of death among men ages 25 to 44.